The Whispering Graveyard. In the heart of a small, fog-covered town named Hollowbrook, there existed a graveyard known as Ravenshade. It sprawled over an expanse of uneven land, a tapestry of crooked tombstones and ancient trees whose twisted branches resembled skeletal fingers clawing at the perpetually gray sky. Ravenshade had stood for over 3 centuries, shrouded in mystery and fear. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the place, warning outsiders never to set foot there after sundown. Rumors of strange occurrences, ghostly whispers, and shadowy figures dancing in the moonlight had woven a dark legend around the graveyard. But for Emma Caldwell, Ravenshade wasn't just a graveyard, it was a mystery begging to be solved. Emma was a 25-year-old journalist with a penchant for uncovering hidden truths. She had moved to Hollowbrook 6 months ago, chasing a story about the town's eerie reputation. With her trusty camera, a leather-bound notebook, and an insatiable curiosity, she had unearthed tales of disappearances, ghost sightings, and a chilling legend about the graveyard's most infamous tomb, the Grave of Whispers. The Grave of Whispers belonged to a man named Elias Blackthorne, a sorcerer accused of summoning the dead. He had been executed by the town's forefathers in 1723 and buried in Ravenshade under a heavy stone slab inscribed with cryptic symbols. The legend claimed that anyone who disturbed Blackthorne's grave would awaken him and unleash a curse upon the town. Some said they had heard whispers emanating from his tomb, pleading for release. Others swore they'd seen ghostly lights hovering above the grave on moonless nights. A fateful decision. It was on a particularly dreary October evening, with rain drizzling down and the wind howling through the trees, that Emma decided to visit Ravenshade. She had spent weeks researching the graveyard and the legend of Elias Blackthorne. Despite the warnings from locals, her curiosity had reached its breaking point. Armed with a flashlight, her camera, and a recorder, she ventured into the graveyard as the sun dipped below the horizon. The iron gates of Ravenshade groaned in protest as she pushed them open. The graveyard was eerily silent, save for the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Emma's flashlight beam danced across the gravestones, illuminating names worn smooth by time. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. She navigated her way to the center of the graveyard, where the Grave of Whispers lay. The tombstone was unlike any other, a massive slab of black granite, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer under the flashlight. Emma set up her camera on a tripod and began recording. October 13th, she whispered into the recorder. "I'm standing before the Grave of Whispers, the resting place of Elias Blackthorne. According to legend, his spirit is said to haunt this graveyard, seeking vengeance for his wrongful execution." As she spoke, a sudden gust of wind swept through the graveyard, extinguishing her flashlight. Emma cursed under her breath and fumbled to turn it back on. When the beam flickered to life, she gasped. A faint, bluish light was emanating from beneath the stone slab. The awakening. Against her better judgment, Emma leaned closer to the grave, her heart pounding. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. She reached out to touch the stone, her fingers trembling. The moment her skin made contact, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but grew louder and more distinct. Multiple voices spoke at once, overlapping in a cacophony of pleas, warnings, and cries for help. Emma stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror. "Release me," a deep, guttural voice boomed above the others, sending chills down her spine. It was coming from the grave. Emma's rational mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. The earth beneath her feet began to tremble. Cracks spidered across the granite slab, and the bluish light intensified, bathing the graveyard in an unearthly glow. With a deafening crack, the stone split in two, and a skeletal hand shot out from the ground. Emma screamed, snapping out of her paralysis. She grabbed her camera and bolted, the recorder still clutched tightly in her hand. Behind her, the whispers morphed into maniacal laughter, and the ground shook violently. She dared to glance over her shoulder and saw a figure emerging from the grave, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes that glowed like embers. Elias Blackthorne had risen. The curse unleashed. Emma didn't stop running until she was safely inside her apartment. She locked the door and collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving. Her camera and recorder lay forgotten beside her as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind replaying the horrifying events in an endless loop. The next morning, Hollowbrook awoke to chaos. The sky was an unnatural shade of red, and a thick, choking fog blanketed the town. People reported hearing disembodied whispers and seeing shadowy figures lurking in their homes. Livestock were found dead, their eyes wide with terror, and crops wilted overnight. Emma knew she had unleashed the curse, and the weight of her actions bore down on her. Determined to make things right, she delved deeper into her research, scouring old town records and forgotten tomes for a way to banish Elias Blackthorne. She learned that the only way to seal him back in his grave was to perform a ritual involving the symbols etched on his tombstone. But to do so, she would have to return to Ravenshade. The final confrontation. With the town spiraling into madness, Emma had no choice but to face her fear. She gathered the necessary items for the ritual, candles, salt, and an ancient incantation written in Latin, and headed back to Ravenshade under the cover of darkness. The graveyard was even more menacing than before, the air thick with an oppressive energy. Elias Blackthorne was waiting for her. He stood near his broken grave, his skeletal form shrouded in a tattered black cloak. His fiery eyes locked onto Emma as she approached, and he let out a bone-chilling laugh. "You dare return?" he hissed, his voice echoing like thunder. "You cannot undo what has been set in motion." Emma ignored his taunts and began setting up the ritual. She arranged the candles in a circle around the grave and sprinkled salt along its perimeter. Elias advanced toward her, his bony fingers outstretched, but he recoiled as she began chanting the incantation. The ground trembled violently, and the whispers grew deafening. Shadows writhed and danced around her, clawing at her with invisible hands. Emma's voice faltered, but she forced herself to continue, her eyes never leaving the symbols on the tombstone. As she uttered the final words of the incantation, a blinding light erupted from the grave. Elias let out a blood-curdling scream as he was dragged back into the earth by unseen forces. The whispers ceased, and the graveyard fell silent once more. The aftermath. When Emma opened her eyes, the grave was sealed, and the symbols on the tombstone no longer shimmered. The oppressive energy that had plagued Ravenshade was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. Emma gathered her belongings and left the graveyard, vowing never to return.